Friends, in these talks, I plan to talk about bilateral diplomacy. It sounds like a boring subject, but actually it can be fun. This time I will speak to 3 points. First, what is bilateral diplomacy? Second, the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which is almost the foundation on which all diplomatic relations are conducted. And third, just to change the tempo a little, we'll talk about the long view of diplomacy. At the end, I will have one last set of points to add. Okay, first, 3 years back, the people who were compiling the Wiley Encyclopedia on Diplomacy were kind enough to invite me to write one essay, and that one essay then became 2 essays. So I have in that wonderful collection of 600 major essays on diplomacy, one on bilateral diplomacy that runs to 6,000 words. But I'll not bombard you with 6,000 words. I will simply cut it down in small, digestible pieces and hopefully also make it interesting. So, first, bilateral diplomacy. It's basically the way in which a country conducts relations with another country. So it really pertains to relations between pairs of countries. Something like 90% of diplomatic missions around the world are bilateral embassies. They are located in a single capital, and from that capital, the embassy deals with that particular country of assignment. It may be France, it may be Gabon, it may be Argentina, or Indonesia for that matter. Each one is unique, each one is different, and each one is special. Are they all equal? Not really. There are the great powers, there are the capitals of what we may call the glamorous centers of the world. It would be Paris and London and Berlin and Washington DC and Moscow, Rome, perhaps Beijing as well, and maybe New Delhi and Caracas and Brasilia for sure. So the way in which that pair of countries work with each other, collaborate with each other, resolve difficulties, negotiate new agreements, overcome problems, all that belongs to the category of bilateral diplomacy. Then there is another kind of diplomacy which we call multilateral diplomacy. That's conducted at the United Nations in New York. It's conducted in Geneva, which is another great center for multilateral work, and in other places where the UN international agencies are located. There is another subcategory of multilateral diplomacy, which is regional diplomacy. That is to say, groups of countries that come together. So there is ASEAN. It started as 5 countries, then became 6, and now consists of 4 more, that is 10 countries, all located in Southeast Asia. There is the African Union. It used to be called the Organization of African Unity, and then they changed the name to the AU, the African Union, which consists of 54 countries located on the continent of Africa. There is the European Union that used to bring together 28 countries in Europe, which is now down to 27 because the UK decided to walk out. And each regional organization works to its own rhythm, in its own ways. But even in regional or global multilateral diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy remains a building block. Because supposing country X wants to propose a resolution at the United Nations, it will reach out to other countries, inviting them to either co-sponsor the resolution or support it. Now, whether a country supports or not will depend partly on the quality of their bilateral relationship. So, bilateral relationships remain the basic medium, the basic currency of international relations. Second, the Vienna Convention of 1961. It's quite amazing that right up to 1961, there wasn't a codified document that put together all the conventions, the methods, the practices that had evolved over 250 years in Europe into one single document. It is to the credit of the International Law Commission, which drafted this document, and the conference that met in Vienna for 2 years and finalized that document. If you read the VCDR, as we call it, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, it's an elegant, short document. And it proves the point that some of the best documents in the world, like powerful constitutions, are the ones that are short, concise, and get to the heart of the matter. The longer a constitution, the more complicated it becomes and more amenable, therefore, to amendments. There are many examples of this around the world. So, coming back to VCDR, the Vienna Convention can be summarized in one single article, which is Article 3. And Article 3 basically says that, and I will need to look this up on my laptop to make sure that I get all the words exactly right. It lays down 5 functions of diplomacy. It's very interesting that the original draft proposed by the Law Commission, the International Law Commission, had 4 words, and a 5th was added through an amendment. The original 4 words were representing, protecting, negotiating, and ascertaining. So what do these words mean? The first word, representing, really means to fly the flag. An embassy represents one country in another country. The second, protecting, it exists to protect the interests of the sending country in the receiving country. It protects citizens, it protects ships and aircraft and all means of communications that belong to the sending country. The third word, negotiating, is probably the most important, because diplomacy at the end of the day is about negotiation. And negotiating is very, very important at all times. The fourth word, ascertaining, is an interesting word. What it really talks about is that it is a job of an embassy to report on conditions in the receiving country. So it is their right to collect information. Now mind you, the 60s, the 50s were times of Cold War. Tension between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. So when it came to the work of embassies to collect information, there was a difference of views. The Soviet bloc countries felt that embassies should not become spying centers, that they should not be the place that went about collecting improper information. So the Vienna Convention built in safeguards in subsequent articles. For example, there is Article 41, which says that an embassy has an obligation to respect the laws of the receiving country. And that's set out in clear terms. All right, so these were the 4 original words. And what was the 5th word that was added? This was a proposal advanced by Yugoslavia, the Philippines, and another country. These 3, in a brilliant move, anticipating the future, added the word promoting. And frankly, today, much of the work of embassies is built around that concept. That is to say, not just protecting or defending the interests of the sending country, but promoting relationships between the countries. That is literally the core of much of diplomatic work. There is a wonderful book written by Eileen Denza, which analyzes the Vienna Convention. The title of the book is International Diplomatic Law, the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Relations, 1961. In that book, Eileen goes through each article, not only to give its genesis, its negotiating history, but also how it has worked in practice. And this is a brilliant work. It's come out, I think, in 5 or 7 editions already. But one small limitation of the book is it's all about Western practices. It does not give sufficient attention, if I may say, to the experience of the countries of the global south, the developing countries. Here is a job that awaits somebody to write a matching book on how the Vienna Convention has actually functioned from the perspective of the countries of the global south. My third point is about the long view of diplomacy. You know, when 2 countries work to advance relationships, cooperate together, promote exchanges between their institutions, people, agencies. Tourism is one example. Sending foreign students is another example. Cultural exchanges, media exchanges, science and technology cooperation, civil aviation and shipping agreements. I mean, the range of activities that countries can undertake is infinite. But sometimes problems come up. Sometimes relationships enter a period of difficulty. What do you do then? You have to find ways of moderating that problem. One classic method is to insulate the problem in a separate box and not let difficulties in one area affect other activities between countries. That's called compartmentalization. It's a good way. But beyond that, it involves taking a long view. And I'll give you 2 examples. In 1979, Vietnam attacked Cambodia. It occupied Cambodia for a while. Southeast Asian countries, led by ASEAN, which consisted of 6 countries, took a very, very firm position, saying we cannot permit a neighboring country to attack another neighboring country. They were clear on that. At the same time, they also understood that Vietnam belongs to their own region. And even if Vietnam has acted in haste, acted in a way that was not according to international norms, they should separate their opposition to the problem from opposition to the country. Now, that's very difficult to manage, but they did it. And they made clear to the government of Vietnam in Hanoi that they were opposed to the action and not to Vietnam. Not every country is able to make that kind of a distinction, but it is to the credit of ASEAN that they took a long view. I'll give you a second example. Again, it involves Vietnam, but this time Vietnam is on the side of the angels. After the Vietnam War ended, Vietnam decided that its future lay in cooperating with the rest of the world. And that began with the United States, which was the leading superpower of the world. Just imagine a country that had received more bombs on its territory than were thrown, than were used during the entire Second World War by both sides. That was Vietnam. Vietnam lost at least 500,000 of its people during that war. That's an incredible price to pay in a country which then had a total population of well under 30 million. Vietnam decided to put aside the past and to rebuild relations with the United States. That's taking a long view. Today, the United States is a major trading partner, a major investor, and a major friend, you can say, of Vietnam. And Vietnam, instead of becoming sour or inward looking or carrying a sense of grievance and hurt, it is more open than many countries in the world. It is one of the strongest advocates of open trade. It is a participant in the new form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which now has a longer name because the United States walked out of it. So 11 countries which remain are strong advocates of regional cooperation in trade, and Vietnam is one of them. I think I've said enough for this first talk. Let me say that in the talks I plan to offer to you through this medium, one unifying theme will be that bilateral diplomacy stands on 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are political diplomacy, economic diplomacy, public diplomacy, which includes exchanges of culture, of education, of science, tourism, and everything else. And finally, consular diplomacy, which also includes reaching out to diasporas. I hope I made this subject slightly interesting, and maybe in the second talk we'll do a better job. Thank you.